Good evening, and welcome to our latest online installment in the Kansas City Public Library Signature Events Series. Before we get started, I want to mention real quick, if you have questions tonight, you can ask those in the chat box or in the comments on the YouTube page, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. And if you're interested in purchasing the book, and I hope that you do, you can find it at most major retailers, but we like to point people toward bookshop.org, where you can find just about any book you're looking for and support independent booksellers across the country. So again, that's bookshop.org. Please give them a look. I mentioned to someone the other day that I was reading the Saddest Words in preparation for the event tonight, and they said, "Oh, that's the new Faulkner biography." And I said, "Well, you got the Faulkner part right." The best way that I could describe this book is equal parts military history, social commentary, and literary criticism. And I think it'll appeal equally to fans of any of those subjects. But what the book really did for me is force me to give some serious thought to where Faulkner stands at a time when we are asking ourselves some difficult and long overdue questions about our country's historic difficulties when it comes to matters of race. Was he something of a pioneer on those issues? Or was he another white writer profiting off of racist caricatures of Black Americans? Dr. Michael Gorra, as you might imagine, has some thoughts on that. He's a professor of English and literature at Smith College in Massachusetts. He's the author of several books, including Portrait of a Novel, Henry James and the Making of an American Masterpiece, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Biography. His essays have appeared in the New York Review of Books, The Atlantic, and the New York Times Book Review, among others. Dr. Gorra, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much for having me, and I want to thank the library for hosting me and Steve for that introduction, and my friends at Liverite for putting us together. I'm going to share my screen, and that will take just a sec, and then I will start talking. There we go. Okay. My title probably seems cryptic, The Saddest Words. There are two of them, Was and Again. They come from William Faulkner's 1929 novel, The Sound and the Fury, and their burden will become clear as I go along. But they're also, of course, the title of this new book from which the talk is drawn. And it's a book that tries to ask a few simple questions, so simple that they're terribly complicated. First, what can Faulkner tell us about the Civil War? And then what can that war tell us about him? How can we use them to think about each other? And how can they help us understand this moment in our national life? Now, I've always read and taught Faulkner, but this isn't a subject I would have predicted for myself back when I began my teaching career. So I want to say a bit about how I got here. In 2010, I was finishing a book on Henry James, and I was living abroad. I was living for a while in Paris, and I was reading the news from home. I was learning in that midterm election year about a new and to me inexplicable movement called the Tea Party. And I was also reading a blog in the New York Times called Disunion. It was 150 years since Lincoln had been elected, and the paper had decided to follow the week-by-week course of the Civil War. I read, and then I heard an echo. It seemed to call up so many of the same issues, as if our time rang off that one, as if nothing had ever stopped or changed or gone away, which is itself a very Faulknerian thought. And then one afternoon, I realized that I wanted to write an American book. Most of my scholarly work so far had been on British things or consciously international, like Henry James. But living abroad had made me far more consciously interested in my own country than I had ever been before. It made me see that I needed to look more closely at our history and our literature, that I needed to sort out what I thought about the American past. I wanted to write as an American about America. And I came to see this as an act, and in some ways a belated act, an act of citizenship as much as of scholarship. What better moment to focus on than the Civil War? And then I saw that I could say everything that I wanted to about that war, and above all about its memory, by taking up a writer I already knew and loved. Now, the project has taken me far beyond Faulkner's work itself. I've let myself sink into the letters and diaries, the speeches and memoirs of the war period, into the other fiction about it, and into the way in which it was depicted in the historiography of Faulkner's own day. even the school books that he used as a boy in his native Oxford, Mississippi. There have been more than a few battlefield visits, a few monuments and memorials to consider as well. Monuments to think about in this summer especially. The war is both everywhere and nowhere in Faulkner. He rarely writes about it explicitly. He doesn't do battle scenes. And yet its causes and consequences, they provide an explanation for everything in his world. But more, it also shapes the deep structure of his imagination. It's always there, even when it doesn't seem to be. And that's how it's going to be in this talk as well. There will be some moments in what follows when I might not seem to be talking about the Civil War itself, as if I'm just focusing on the private life of a few of Faulkner's characters. But I am talking about it, always. Now, many of you will know that he set most of his work in a place he called Yoknapatawpha County, an imaginary realm in his home state. He often carried characters over from one work to another, plot lines too, as if what he had to say couldn't be confined to a single book. In particular, he wrote 2 novels about a character he called Quentin. And oddly enough, each of them is set partly in Massachusetts, at Harvard, where Faulkner himself had not yet been when he first invented the character. One of those books is called Absaloms Absolute. It was published in 1936, and it depends on the question that Quentin has been asked ever since Hughes arrived at Harvard in the fall of 1909. Tell about the South. What's it like there? What do they do there? Why do they live there? Why do they live at all? That's what Faulkner says. That's what the other Harvard students want to know. And Quentin tries to answer those questions by telling a story that goes back to 1830, a piece of history that turns inevitably upon race and inheritance. But that was Faulkner's second novel about him. The Sound and the Fury came first. And there Quentin kills himself at the end of his freshman year. He drowns himself in the Charles. So whatever he says in Absaloms is the testimony of somebody who's already dead. But I'm not going to start with Quentin or even with Faulkner. I'm going to start instead with Henry James, my other novelist, and with a character called Basil Ransom from his 1886 novel, The Bostonians. I'm going to start there because Basil, too, originally comes from Mississippi. He's a lawyer, and he goes to Boston on business, and he gets taken to see a new building on the Harvard campus, a place called Memorial Hall that was built in 1874, a monument to the Union cause. Basil's hostess wonders if it might be indelicate to bring him there, because after all, he'd fought for the Confederacy. He's willing, though, and he even agrees with an inscription on that wall that claims that the dead were brave. Well, so they were, he says. I must be brave enough to face them. It isn't the first time. The Memorial Hall is divided into 3, with a theater on one side and a dining hall on the other. But its real business happens in the nave between them, a high arched aisle that's pierced at either end by a rose window. And on its walls are a set of tablets with the names of Harvard's Civil War dead, or most of them, listing them first by their class year, and then by the battle and the date of their death. James writes that the hall speaks of duty and honor and sacrifice, but he doesn't tell us the particular meaning that the place had for him. 2 of his cousins are listed there, and so is a man named Robert Gould Shaw, the colonel of the 54th Massachusetts, in which his brother Wilkie was a junior officer. Now that was a regiment of Black troops with white officers, one of the first such units in an army that was at first reluctant to accept them. They took heavy casualties in their first major battle at Fort Wagner near Charleston. They were defeated, but in defeat, they showed a skeptical white America that Black men would make good soldiers. And I'll have more to say about that later. The plaques for the class of 1860, they note 12 names, over 10% of its number. 11 men on that wall died at Gettysburg. And to Basil, the place seems the very reverse of a challenge or taunt. He was capable of being a generous foeman, James writes, and he forgot now the whole question of sides and parties, remembering only that he too had been a soldier. That is what to him the building commemorates, arching over friends as well as enemies, the victims of defeat as well as the sons of triumph. The Bostonians was serialized in a magazine called The Century. It's really the best magazine, the best American magazine of the late 19th century. Its editor, Richard Watson Gilder, he'd fought for the Union, but he hoped to find a way to heal the division between the different parts of white America. And so many of the magazine's pages in the 1880s, they were devoted to a series called Battles and Leaders of the Civil War. It's a set of first-person memoirs by the surviving commanders on either side that claimed to look at the conflict from a strictly military point of view, to analyze neither the war's causes nor its consequences. Basil's note of reconciliation, that is, that's very much the note of the magazine itself, the place where his story was first published. And for many men like him, as the historian Drew Gilpin Faust has written, that soldier's sense of shared suffering would override all sectional or ideological differences and establish, I quote, sacrifice and its memorialization as the ground on which North and South would ultimately reunite. Yet that sense of a common loss, that emerged only after the end of Reconstruction. It was not the spirit in which Memorial Hall was built, and a dedicatory carving on the wall tells us that the building marks the patriotism of those who served in the Army and Navy of the United States during the War for the Preservation of the Union. It was built for the Union dead, the nation's loyal citizens, and for them only. Harvard's Confederate dead are given no place in that memorial space. Memorial Hall is a space of triumph, and frank about it. A few decades after the war was over, and when this reconciliation movement was underway, Frederick Douglass found that he needed to remind people that there had indeed been a right side to the Civil War and a wrong one. Reconciliation for him, that had gone too far. But Memorial Hall doesn't forget such things, and it insists that neither the Confederacy nor its soldiers have any claim on the polity they sought to ruin. Still, whenever I read the Bostonians, I'm stirred by Basil's open-hearted emotion. And when I step inside Memorial Hall, I remember that during the academic year of 1909 to 1910, an equally fictional Mississippian would have had to enter that building 3 times a day, at least if he wanted to eat. Now, there are other doors to the dining hall, and Faulkner's Quentin, he wouldn't always have had to walk past that line of dead names, dead Union names, though maybe sometimes he did, this young Southerner who would die in the North himself. What would he have made of them? Now, The Sound and the Fury began as a short story about 4 children whose parents have sent them outside to play. They're hoping to keep the kids from realizing that their grandmothers just died. But the second Compson child is curious. She's a girl called Caddy for Candace. And the kids have been splashing in a creek. Her drawers under her short dress have gotten muddy and wet. Now she climbs a tree next to the house. She looks in an upstairs window. She was curious. She wants to see what's going on. And her brothers, they stare up at her from below. That moment will fix them forever. Caddy remains adventurous and soiled, ruled by a desire that ends with her expulsion from the family. Her older brother Quentin stays in place, afraid to follow and yet wanting to. And then Jason, who threatens to tell on her. The youngest Compson child, Benji, he watches without being able to speak. He's the idiot in the lines from which Faulkner takes his title, someone whose tale is full of sound and fury, and we first see Caddy through his eyes. Benji Compson can't distinguish between past and present. His first-person narration slips from moment to moment, back from his nominal present in 1928 and into childhood, then to some nearer date, and back again, each period encased within another, and the movement between them triggered by association or repetition. He provides the bobbled lens through which we first approach this family history. Caddy's promiscuity, her pregnancy by one man and her short-lived marriage to another, their father's fatal alcoholism, Quentin's suicide, and the ruins of family life that follow. Faulkner later said that he had tried to tell all this through Benji alone. It didn't work, and so he started over, this time with a section in Quentin's voice, and set in 1910 on the last day of his life. Try again, fail again. And he moved the narration back to 1928, and he gave it over to the vicious Jason. But it still wasn't enough, he said. And so he said, I'll let Faulkner try it, with a concluding section written in the third person. Each of the three first-person sections, each of those depends not on the narrator's present, but rather on the past he can't escape. And in each case, that past is defined in terms of the sibling whose voice we don't hear. Caddy Compson is both missing and not. She's an absent presence to whom her brothers cannot ever accommodate themselves. And none of them will ever get over her. To be traumatized, as the cultural historian Kathy Carruth has written, is precisely to be possessed by an image or event, an experience one cannot master, the unwitting reenactment of an event that one cannot simply leave behind. Trauma lies in our delayed response to a violence that our minds cannot encompass. It's an unwilled memory, a repetition that forces us to relive our past, a fateful sense of doomed reiteration. Those who suffer from it have no choice but to circle around their own experience, approaching the psychic space where they least want to be, and yet must, drawn by its fascination and its horror. Faulkner tells the Compson story 4 times, hoping that each will be its last. And the brothers themselves, they always return to Caddy's memory, sniffing at it, unable to let it alone. For Benji, she was comfort. To Jason, she contains the future he hasn't had. But for my purposes, Quentin is the one who matters here. On the last day of his life, most of what happens to Quentin will happen in memory. Most of what counts, anyway. He knows what he'll do that night, and he buys 2 flat irons to weight his way in the river. He sits next to a black man on the streetcar and is amazed at how easy he finds it. But what's really determinative is the life that lies behind him, the life in memory, the past in which he couldn't stop Caddy from being who she is. What matters is his failure. And so the day slips gears, and he stands by the creek where they had played as children. Caddy lies in the water, her skirt soaked and flopping against her as she climbs out. Then she sits with her face tilted back in the gray light, the smell of honeysuckle. Push it in, she tells him. Push harder. I want you to. And he asks her to touch it, to put out her hand and guide his way. Her hand upon the knife that he holds at her throat. And she's willing, she says, willing to die, as she says she did when the other men touched her. Have you ever done that, she asks. And he asks her how many there have been, and she can only say, too many. Neurologists have identified a disorder called hyperthymesia, in which a memory presents itself unbidden with a totality of sensory detail. Those afflicted with it can see their own past as if it were a film, a continuous show, reruns of unforgettable reruns. Such memories seem more real than one's very present. And so Quentin's conversations with both Caddy and their father will return to him throughout the day. Two moments in which he seems to lose his present, in which he seems to step fully into his past. Two such moments call for particular attention. After he fails with the knife, Quentin goes looking for a man named Dalton Ames. He's not Caddy's first lover, but he is the man who's gotten her pregnant. And when they meet in a bridge, Quentin orders him to leave town. I say you must go, not my father, not anybody, I say it. And if Dalton doesn't, I'll kill you. Now, Ames is both amused and concerned. He tells Quentin not to take it so hard. But when the boy repeatedly tries to hit him, the man does have to stop him. Only then does Quentin realize that he's holding a wet and blood-stained rag, that his eye smarts and his face feels cold. He isn't in Mississippi at all, but rather in Massachusetts still. And without realizing it, he's picked and lost a fight with another Harvard student, another young man who's been talking too casually about women. It is Quentin has gone into a fugue in which the present seems to vanish, the fight triggered by the memory by the fight. And the present has vanished for us as well. We read in this part of the novel, we read for a dozen pages without quite knowing where Quentin physically is. And only Faulkner's broken syntax, the unpunctuated and lowercase lines of dialogue spilling down the stage, that's the only thing here to remind us that we're really inside Quentin's mind. The day remembers itself for him. Then he snaps to. He snaps back into the present. And his roommate Shreve tells him that he's going to have a shiner. So too, a crucial conversation with his father replays itself in his mind. It's a conversation about his own inability to accept what Caddy has done, to accept the fact that she's no longer a virgin. Your anguish, his father says, your anguish grows out of a purely temporary state. That's what virginity is, both Caddy's and his own. It's something we're meant to move on from, something we're meant to lose. And so is pain itself. But the boy will have none of it. And I, temporary, and he, you cannot bear to think that someday it will no longer hurt you like this. And I, temporary, and he was the saddest word of all. There is nothing else in the world. It's not despair until time. It's not even time until it was. Was. Something that was lies in the past. It's fixed and unchanging, concluded, and therefore temporary indeed. Is, in contrast, is ongoing and permanent. Is, for Quentin, is trauma. It's the ever-present family history that defines him. The only thing worse than the pain it brings, the only thing worse would be the belief that he might someday get over it, that it would indeed be temporary. Was allows survival. And yet to discard that trauma, to believe that he might outlive it, that dismisses the very wound that has come to constitute the self. Quentin would rather die than imagine that someday it will no longer hurt. And Mr. Compson recognizes that. Was is the saddest word. It's the past that one cannot mend. But Quentin will find a different word. The full memory of this talk, it returns to him only at the very end of the evening, the very end of the chapter that Faulkner devotes to him. It returns to him just a little while before he kills himself. And yet that conversation has been at the edge of his mind all day. That morning he stood along the Charles, and with a stiff envelope of his suicide note crackling through his coat. For a second then he imagines himself in the future as if he's going to live. But then his father's word comes back to him when spoken in Mississippi the summer before. Was. That's what he soon will be. Was, past tense. But here that time-laden syllable floats on the page without explanation. Quentin has already had that conversation with his father. We haven't. Not yet. We haven't read it yet. For us, it lies 50 pages on. And so we can't know what that word means to him. So his next thought at this early moment in his narrative seems rather cryptic. Again, sadder than was. Again, saddest of all. Again. We won't understand that claim until it becomes literally true. Until that exchange with his father runs through his head once more. We'll hear those words again. He'll remember Caddy again. Sadder than was. Saddest of all. Excuse me, I need a little liquid. But what does all this have to do with the war? All this excursion into the lives of these characters? That's the question I want to explore now before returning us to Memorial Hall at the end of my talk. The literary historian Eric Sundquist has argued that Faulkner's abiding subject is the inchoate grief and unfulfilled desire to which his characters are forever subject, close quotes. But that anguish is never purely personal. There's a deep congruity between the movements of Faulkner's mind with its sense of an inescapable family trauma and the history and culture of his region. So deep that it hardly seems possible to distinguish between them. The Reverend Hightower in Enlightened August from 1930, he believes that his life had already ceased before it began, that he is but a single instance of darkness in which a horse galloped and a gun crashed, and his Confederate grandfather fell in the dust. Or take a later novel, Intruder in the Dust from 1948. That book tells us that there's a place in the mind of every Southern white boy when it is still not yet 2 o'clock on the third day of Gettysburg, and Pickett's failed charge against the Union has not yet begun. That's what Quentin wants, a past that is still not yet, that has yet to become was, a moment in which it all still is, a moment before the past becomes irrevocable, and in which he can stay forever. Someday all this will no longer hurt him, Mr. Compson says, but that's precisely what he cannot accept. He can't accept the idea of outliving his own pain. Quentin lives in an afterlife. And what he has to tell us about the South is that it all happens over and over again. The same troubles and events, the same quarrels, the same memories of generations repeating themselves. Now, there are many ways to understand this, but for me, the most useful lies in pushing our sense of trauma beyond the bounds of the individual psyche, as indeed Freud suggested we should. Because insofar as different people recall a past in common, so they may share the same wounds. But Freud also suggests that the traumatic event remains unrepresentable. The event itself, as opposed to its memory. Faulkner likes to work up to and then away from the moment of climax. He almost never presents it directly, but prefers to ride around a gap instead. We never actually see Catty Compson, for example. We know only her remembered presence, only her presence in the narratives her brothers tell, only the pain of her loss. And so it is with the Civil War itself. It's everywhere felt, and yet in Faulkner's work, it's nowhere fully presented. His readers walk around its edges. They hear the past as it cries out for Quentin, and perhaps for his creator too, a trauma induced by a pain they have never not known, their voices marked by the compulsion to repeat, part of the pleasure principle that endures even in pleasure's absence. Again. Yet this raises a question. The Sound and the Fury ends with a scene on the town square, where the statue of, I quote, a Confederate soldier gazed with empty eyes beneath his marble hand in wind and weather. Now, if you're looking closely, you'll see that this one doesn't have his hand up to his eyes. That's because in the novel, Faulkner fused two statues in his hometown of Oxford into one. This one on the square, and then the one on the campus of the University of Mississippi, where the soldier does indeed hold his hand over his eyes to shade them. Monuments remind us that we must always remember. Memorials that we should never forget. But what does such a statue ask us to remember? And what does that memory require we forget? In Faulkner's day, the white South filled its public spaces with mementos to its own ruined cause. They mastered the rhetoric of victimhood. And indeed, its people were victims of what they had done to themselves above all. They were also perpetrators. Their insistence on their own sense of loss effectively denied the greater trauma with which the land was stained, the trauma that Lincoln described in his second inaugural as 250 years of bloody and unrequited toil. But that denial wasn't limited to the South. It belonged to most of white America, the country in which the blue and the gray had reconciled themselves and become one. And meanwhile, the marble man stands sentry in the courthouse square, in silent triumph over the resubdued Black body. In fact, the book's famous last page makes that literally true. On that page, the teenage servant, Luster, he tries to take the Compson carriage to the statue's left rather than to the accustomed right, and he gets a beating in consequence. Nevertheless, the past will speak, despite that statue. And here I'm going to make a jump in both time and space. And one night I was walking with my family down a residential street in the German city of Hamburg. It's a city I knew well, but as I looked ahead of me, I saw something new on the sidewalk before me. I saw a brass plate I got way ahead of myself, I'm sorry. My PowerPoint jumped and I have to get it back. And my mouse has lost its connection. It will come back in a second. I'm so sorry for that. Hang on. Okay, I got it. Okay, sorry about that. My mouse has lost power. So I was walking down the street in the German city of Hamburg, and I saw a bright new metallic gleam in the streetlight. When we bent to look, we saw a brass plate the size and shape of the cobblestone it had replaced. It was engraved with a name and some dates. And in front of the next house, we saw another, and then another down the block. All the surnames were Jewish, but though their birth dates had varied Everyone listed on those stones, those little plaques, had died in 1942 or 1943 at places whose names we knew too well. Scholkerstein, they're called. Stumble stones. And they mark the last address at which the person they named had lived freely. Each of them remembers a particular person at a particular place, not an abstract mass of victims. And there are now many thousands of these stumble stones installed throughout Germany and indeed the whole of Europe. Local groups, school children, sometimes the current householder. People like that do the necessary research to find out who had once lived at a given address. And then Gunther Demnig, the artist who conceived of the project, he then makes the stone by hand with the brass attached to a concrete cube. And here's a picture of one of them. Now, Germany has many memorials to the Holocaust, and they're often quite cerebral. Installations for which the visitor usually needs some explanation, a bit of text to tell him what he's seeing. Such places avoid the blunt legibility of a statue or a catafalque. You need to work at what they say, to puzzle over them, halting at an impasse of meaning, rather than moving directly from a representational image to some expected emotion, some expected moment of sorrow or loss. But you have to think before you get there. Now, the genius of Demnig's work is that its burden seems immediately clear. You can tell what those stones are about. And yet one stumbles anyway. You might almost literally stumble if you bend to look. You'll look as if you're stumbling. You look, you pause, you think. That brassy glow forces you to stop short. It's a sight you've come upon casually, without looking for it, and it then forces itself upon you. Atrocity happened here. Now, these are the best examples I know of what in German is called Vergangenheitsbewältigung. It's a long, awkward word. It's a word made by putting a couple of words together. It's the process of working through Bewältigung, working through the past, Vergangenheits. It's what one does, must do, with a difficult and recalcitrant history. It's a struggle that may last for generations and that extends even to those individuals who carry no personal share of the burden. That work is unfinished and indeed unfinishable. And many on that country's right have always resented it. Nevertheless, the process itself has become a central part of modern Germany's national identity. And for many non-Germans, the seriousness of that engagement stands as a model to emulate. It took a generation fully to begin. In the American South, it took a century. Of course, it's profoundly anachronistic to lament the inability of the Confederacy's immediate survivors to overcome their past, to note their failure to engage in anything like it. I say it's anachronistic because the very concept depends upon a psychoanalytic language that did not then exist. What did exist was a religious vocabulary that might have gotten them to the same place, a vocabulary of justice and atonement. If only the Southern churches had not long before made their peace with slavery. Many Germans felt sorry for themselves when the shooting was over. Few of them insisted that they had been perfectly within their rights. But that's what the Richmond journalist Edward Pollard did in an 1866 book called The Lost Cause, and John Meacham has recently written an essay on this book for the New York Times Book Review. The Lost Cause, Edward A. Pollard, 1866. Secession might have proved a practical impossibility, but the South had merely bowed to what Robert E. Lee called the North's superior numbers and resources. Their soldiers had lost. Their principles, they thought, remained unvanquished. No analogy is perfect, but I have never in Germany seen anything like a conventional memorial to the Second World War. I've noticed that. The philosopher Susan Neiman has pointed it out as well in a recent book called Learning from the Germans, which pursues this analogy, the one I'm making now, at length. No carved or cast figure of Erwin Rommel, still less of Hermann Goering or of Hitler himself, looms above a German city, as Lee or J.E.B. Stuart have historically done above Virginia's capital. Though, of course, the statues of Richmond's Monument Avenue, they're not really meant to honor their nominal subjects. They went up around the turn of the 20th century as a way to remind us all of who was once more in charge. And now, of course, that's changing in this very summer, as we've all seen on the news. Richmond itself has decided to remove the Confederate memorials it controls, those to Stuart, Stonewall Jackson, and Jefferson Davis. An injunction against their removal has been thrown out. The removal proceeds and I think may now be done. The enormous statue of Robert E. Lee remains because the state owns that and the legal work isn't yet done. But many of us have seen pictures of the changes made to it this summer. I know that the circle around it has become a space where African-American dance troupes have been performing and where graffiti artists have been at work. The South's own work in confronting its past and its present, that eventually took public forum in Selma, in Birmingham, at a Greensboro lunch counter, and even at Jimmy Carter's church in Plains. It happens now at Montgomery's new National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which tries to record every lynching and whose director, Brian Stevenson, has also spoken of the German analogy. It's happening in Faulkner's hometown of Oxford, where at the University of Mississippi, a series of skeptical contextualizing plaques have been placed next to the sites associated with the Confederacy, including tablets that document the labor of the slaves once owned by the university itself. That school has also decided to remove its own Confederate memorial, the statue memorializing an army unit that was raised on the campus, to move it from a place where everybody entering the campus must see it to a cemetery, though the statue on the town's courthouse square, that does remain for now. I think some of this work of confronting the past, though, I think some of that work had to happen in print before it could happen in public. And maybe fiction ran just a little bit ahead of its time. Because Faulkner's own books, they are in themselves Scholkerstein. And perhaps The Sound of the Fury stands as the greatest of them, the greatest of his attempts at Vergangenheitsbewältigung, the greatest because the most intractable, the book most marked by a sense of its own failure. Mastering the past, that's precisely what Quentin Compson has not been able to do. No matter how much he struggles and fights, he can't do it because the past for him is not even past, because he still lives in the moment of loss. It simply goes on happening. And yet the novelist's account of that very impossibility, that stands in itself as an instance of that never finished process. I'll move toward a conclusion and change my focus again in doing so. In 1961, the novelist and poet Robert Penn Warren marked the war's centennial with a book-length essay called The Legacy of the Civil War, a legacy he defined in terms of the very different psychological costs that the war had imposed on either side. The white South embraced what he called the great alibi, in which a reference to defeat served to justify its every failing: poverty, laziness, lynching. The war was held to excuse them all. That belief allowed the South to evade its reckoning with what Lincoln called the offense of American slavery. It stands as one reason why it did not do the work of Vergangenheitsbewältigung. But the Yankees had a corresponding myth, and one that Warren found, quote, equally corrosive. Southerners felt trapped by history, but Northerners believed themselves redeemed by it. They, perhaps I might say I, we forgot how many Yankee fortunes depended on slave-grown cotton, saw the war as having filled the region's treasury of virtue. Victory underlined the section's sense of its own righteousness. It left it free to enjoy its own prejudices. Whenever I stand inside Harvard's Memorial Hall, I feel just a little bit smug, as though I were drawing on that still undepleted treasury. My side was right. But the building wants to persuade us that victory proves it was right, and the place seems all too effective in doing so. That makes me recoil from my own northern reflexes. It makes me think for a moment that maybe the Century magazine's belief in reconciliation, maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. And that emphasis to which Drew Faust has spoken, that emphasis on reunion through a sense of shared suffering, yet an emotional appeal like the one I've just described, that emotional appeal to reconciliation. That's no substitute for historical or political judgment. In Richmond, we can indeed still drive down Memorial Avenue. We drive around the grand equestrian sculpture of Lee, 60 feet high, from the base of it, from its stone base to the top of his head. For a century, the one to Jefferson Davis stood further down the road, a century and more, a tall man standing before the kind of column that usually marks a victory. There have been moments in our past when this meaning of the Civil War has seemed settled. This now, in 2020, is not one of them. And the questions of race and region and remembrance that the thought of that war provokes, they seem to lie again at the heart of our national life. This summer has made them all vivid again. I will always second guess myself. But I do think that Memorial Hall is finally a legitimate exercise of public memory. It crows a bit in marking the victory of the United States, but its act of commemoration is just and right, and in part because its focus is on the individual names of the dead. The Confederate statues on Monument Avenue don't have that legitimacy. The one to Lee was erected in 1890, and it spoke at the time to the tyranny of Virginia's majority opinion. But it has never served a morally valid purpose, and its presence was always a great wrong. That is, it was a monument that was always intended as an insult to a large portion of Virginia's citizens. The Sound of the Fury doesn't say anything about Memorial Hall, but it does provide a curious relic of the war in the form of a minor character called Deacon. He's a Black man who has met every train at the start of school for the last 40 years. He runs errands, lives on tips, and he's been in and out of Quentin's room all year. Sometimes he appears in a costume of patches, dressed like Uncle Tom and talking like Uncle Remus. At others, he wears a Brooks Brothers suit. He switches codes and speaks as one gentleman to another. The details of his biography are never clear, though, and Quentin doesn't even know where he comes from. 40 years takes us back to 1870, when the memory of the fighting was new. Is Deacon a Southerner? Was he born a slave? He likes parades and ceremonies, and Quentin has seen him just a few days before, stepping out for Decoration Day in the uniform of the Grand Army of the Republic. Now, the GAR was a fraternal organization whose members had all served in the Union's forces. Its posts were integrated, and during Reconstruction, it fought for Black voting rights. Many of Deacon's clothes are other people's cast-offs, but I like to think that the uniform was his from the start, that he might once have been a soldier. And no matter that uniform's source, a man with Deacon's sense of occasion would, if he were real, have been on Boston Common in May 1897 for the unveiling of Augustus St. Gaudens's bronze relief in honor of the 54th Massachusetts. I put this slide up a little earlier than I anticipated, but there it is. That's the particular relief I'm talking about. This is New England's most stirring work of Civil War memory. It sits at the very top of Beacon Hill, across the street from the State House. Many things make it powerful, and among them is the perfect fusion between the artist's skill and the ethical imperatives of his subject. Nothing here is abstract. Canteens and shoes, the seam of a trouser's leg, the stripes on a soldier's arm, the bedrolls creased by the straps that hold them onto each soldier's pack. No other work of Civil War statuary can match the perfection of its detail, not at Gettysburg or Shiloh, not in any city square of North or South. But that alone is not the source of its power. St. Gaudens shows these individual men, and they are individuals. Every face here is different. He shows these men at the start of the journey that would lead to their defeat near Charleston. His work implies a story. It has the narrative of force of a great history painting. And that force reminds us why the Civil War was necessary. Now, the work was intended as a memorial to Shaw himself, rather than to his regiment. And it's true that his figure is the first we see. But the faces of his soldiers are modeled with equal care. And time has renamed the work in our minds, making the individual moment into a collective one. What the statue actually captures is the parade, the ceremonial parade the regiment made through Boston right before they embarked. And during that parade, Shaw would have been, as a matter of realistic fact, positioned on the outside of his men, riding his horse alongside them. Time has renamed the work in our minds, as I've said. It makes the individual work into a collective one. I don't think many people in Boston think of it now as the Shaw Memorial. It's the memorial to the 54th. Now, its dedication was a great ceremony, with speeches by the governor and the mayor, though not unfortunately by any of the surviving soldiers. Booker T. Washington was asked to talk instead. And then the Harvard philosopher William James, brother of Henry, and more importantly here of Wilkie James, the 54th adjutant, who died in 1883, never quite recovering from the war and its wounds. And already James notes that this memorial, it's not for Shaw alone, that the care with which St. Gaudens has depicted a group of ordinary soldiers, rather than some great captain, that care makes it exceptional. Except, of course, he says, they were not ordinary soldiers. They were the first Black regiment to be recruited in the North, and as such, an embodiment of the war itself, a reminder, in James's words, that there are Americans of all colors and conditions. That is why he says Massachusetts has honored a regiment that lost its fight. And in describing both the monument and the troops' own march, he seems to echo the battle hymn of the Republic. But then St. Gaudens' work, it is itself a version of that great hymn. It gives us the terrible swift sword in bronze. Let us die to make men free. So Julia Ward Howe wrote in 1862. And that is the resolution the sculptor has placed in each man's eyes. They did not make this war, their faces say, but they have accepted it, and they will not call retreat. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gorra. That was fantastic. We have time for a few audience questions here, but I wanted to start with one of my own, if I might.
Sure, and I'm sorry, without my mouse, I can't get rid of this screen share.
I think that I can do that for
okay,
you.
Thank you.
Perfect. There we go.
Great, thank you so much, Steve.
No problem. So there are a lot of moments in the book that kind of stood out to me. But the first one actually came early on, 35 words in to be exact.
Okay.
When you call Faulkner the most important novelist of the 20th century.
Yes.
Not among the most important, not arguably the most important, the most important.
Right.
And I was wondering if you could just make your case for Faulkner over people like Fitzgerald, Hemingway,
Right.
Steinbeck, and Lee.
Right, sure. So the most important American novelist. I think that Hemingway, I think the comparable case perhaps would be Hemingway, although we have yet to see how the influence of Bellow and Toni Morrison plays out over the decades. Hemingway's influence is stylistic, it's sentence by sentence. That Hemingway is an innovator on the level of the sentence. He's not an innovator in the form of the novel. He tells basically chronological narratives with a heavy reliance on dialogue. They don't do much in the way of formal innovation. Great Gatsby obviously is an enormous influence on many people, but I think that's the only one of Faulkner's novels of Fitzgerald's novels that have had that influence. With Faulkner, there's a huge shelf of works, just a huge shelf of works. And that influence has gone in many, many ways. Southern America, the literature of the American South, in the decades, the generations that follow, is sort of inconceivable without Faulkner. Everybody is either following him or running away from him as fast as they can. And I think you're the wonderful Flannery O'Connor line that somebody asked what it was like to write in Faulkner's shadow, and she says, "When the Dixie Limited's coming down the tracks, you just get out of the way." That he was inescapable. You don't want to be caught doing the same things he does because he will overwhelm you, and yet there's an attraction to the train. He's been an enormous influence on African-American literature too. Ralph Ellison spoke to his influence. Morrison herself to his great presence. Right now, younger writers like Jesmyn Ward and Natasha Trethewey, they might be fighting him, but they're engaging with him. But beyond that, I think also the innovations that Faulkner plays with time and memory, with point of view, have been influential for writers outside that South. The sheer ambition of his sentences, his willingness to try new things in every novel. There's also the fact that our sense of the past is an inescapable thing. That he's the one who gives voice to that more than I think any other American novelist, 19th or 20th century. Hawthorne may be the possible exception. That's become part of the way we're learning to think about our American past. Beyond that, though, and I know this answer is going on, but I feel passionately about it. Faulkner's had an enormous influence abroad on French fiction. A lot of French writing from the 1930s on is heavily influenced by Faulkner. Beyond that, though, my book has gotten one review abroad. It's in a Spanish newspaper. This book hasn't been translated, but it was in the leading Madrid newspaper, El País, and the leading contemporary Spanish writer, Antonio Munoz Molina, wrote that Faulkner has been crucial for both Spanish and Latin American writers. Gabriel Garcia Marquez took one of his inspirations for Macondo in 100 Years of Solitude from Faulkner, because he thought that Faulkner showed how you could write about what looks like a cultural backwater, an isolated place cut off from great cities and make great literature out of that. And Garcia Marquez thought of that as an inspiration for what he wanted to do in writing about Colombia. So I could go on, but I'll stop there because I'm, let's see if there are other questions, but thank you for that one.
Absolutely.
35 words in, that's good.
So there an audience question here that's a good one, given that we're a week and a half out from the from Banned Books Week now. Dr. Gorra, how would you respond to a request to not include Faulkner in a college level Western civilization course? Would an instructor be justified in removing him from a syllabus?
I have a complicated answer to that question. Because I think that in a Western Civ course, you have an enormous range of material you can deal with. I'm not certain that there's any single 20th century novelist who has to be on that list. There's no single 20th century novelist who has to be on that list. You have to have some example of international modernism to be on that list. So whether it's Faulkner, whether it's Virginia Woolf, whether it's Joyce's Portrait of the Artist, whether it's Joseph Conrad, you need a 20th century modernist. I'm not saying you need Faulkner. Now, if it's an American literature course, I think absolutely you do need Faulkner. You do need Faulkner. And in doing that, I think some of the reasons people might want to remove him is because he can be controversial. His characters use the N-word all the time. He writes about racially fraught topics. I don't like the word trigger warnings, but I do give my students in my Faulkner class, I give them what movie reviews call a content advisory. I say, we're going to have that word. We're going to have rape, murder, incest. In one book, bestiality. We're going to have violent death. We're going to have every crime imaginable. And I just want you to know that, the way that, the movie reviews will say why this movie got an R rating. I think he's got to be in an American literature class that doesn't say that you have to admire everything that's on that page. I myself think that literature becomes most alive, not when it's presented as something to bow down before, but as something to wrestle with, to engage with, sometimes to argue, to admire and to argue with, to fight with. I think that's when literature for me is most alive, when you are engaged and sometimes when you're quarreling with it, which is what say writers in the African American tradition have been doing with Faulkner. What actually Southern writers like Flannery O'Connor were doing. There was an agonistic relationship, and they fought him. I like to encourage that in my students too.
Here's another audience question. Do you have a sense of how people in the South felt about the way Faulkner wrote about the South? Were there any instances where maybe he revealed things that they'd rather he not have talked about?
Oh, absolutely. So this is a story in the book, but Faulkner's uncle, who was a tough lawyer, sort of half a generation older, and who didn't think much of Billy when Billy was young. That's what they called him in the family. He said even after, well on into the 1930s, even later, he says, I don't think very much of Billy's books. I don't read them much. I guess he makes money off from writing those dirty books for Yankees. That is how he was regarded by a lot of proper Mississippians. He's writing dirty books for Yankees. He's, and to the degree the publishing industry was in New York, they were, in that sense, being published by Yankees, certainly. He's wrote books that did spill secrets. Sometimes he exaggerated things. Some college libraries in the South in the 1930s didn't want to have his books. Now, this is a thing that often happens to writers from groups that are perceived as marginalized. And the peculiar thing here is Faulkner writes as a member of a dominant class, white Southerners, that is nevertheless marginalized within US culture as a whole. And he gets accused of saying things we should keep in the family, as it were. This is something that writers from other marginalized groups run into all the time. Philip Roth, when he was a young man, was told, you shouldn't say those things about our people in front of Christian readers. Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison got the same kind of complaints. Don't show us in that light. So this is sort of a frequent thing. But yes, Faulkner got a lot of criticism. As time went on, younger writers or writers his own age began to realize there was something pretty special going on in Oxford, and began to write critical essays about him. But it took a while for any kind of wide acceptance to come. I'm not even certain that the Nobel Prize did it fully in his hometown. They liked the fact eventually that he was bringing tourists there, or that a movie based on one of his books, Intruding the Dust, was shot in Oxford. That brought business. But they had reservations about the work. That's a great question. Thank you.
So we'll do two more here. Over the course of all of his work, is there a particular character that most closely resembles Faulkner himself? Not so much in terms of biography, but maybe in terms of a belief system.
I want to say yes and no. There's a character in some of his later books, in Intruder in the Dust, and then in figures in some other books. He's the leading lawyer in Jefferson, which is the name he gave to his town. It's a man named Gavin Stevens, who will often explain things, explain the meaning of Southern history. He'll explain the relations between different parts of the county. That's probably as close as it comes, except that Faulkner also presents him ironically, skeptically, as a kind of windbag in places. So there's no character who really is like the Faulkner persona. It's not like if you read Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms, and we know that Hemingway, in creating Frederick Henry, the narrator of that novel, has drawn very much on his own experience in World War I and his own early love affairs. Hemingway's gone beyond Frederick Henry, but he's still, there's a lot of the author in him. Faulkner is somebody more who has a lot of different voices and characters and people jostling around inside him, and he wants to let them out. So that I would say, Stevens talks a lot, and much more than Faulkner ever did in person. Faulkner talked only on the page. But there are moments when he seems a little close to the author, and then moments when Faulkner sort of washes his hands of him and makes us see that he's a little bit of a fool.
And I changed my mind. We're going to do two more because we got another one in here that I really like.
Okay.
Has Faulkner taken any criticism for The Sound and the Fury for the depiction of Benji, a differently abled character, from members of that community? And if so, is that criticism warranted?
Right, that's a good question. This is, of course, a new strain in Faulkner criticism that people tended to, for much of the critical history of the novel, people just tended to read Benji as what the quotation from Macbeth says is an idiot. They might say he has Down syndrome and so on. Disability studies in critical literature is a growth area. I've seen more recent readings that suggest that Benji is in some ways autistic, however one wants to define that. The criticism is more directed at other critics, at earlier critics for their sort of narrow version of Benjy. That not so much at Faulkner himself. Now this may change because this is an area, as I say, where there's a lot of critical literature being written about Benjy in particular from a disability studies point of view. Yeah, the criticism is more directed at earlier critical traditions than at Faulkner himself. I will say here that he did have an actual person in mind when he created Benjy. It was a young man who lived in town in a large white house with a history to the house and with a wrought iron fence around its yard. It's very much like the Compson house. If you visit Oxford, people will take you and drive you by and say, that's the model for the Compson house. And this man's name was Edwin Chandler. His older sister had been Faulkner's first grade teacher. He would run along the fence looking at people. Faulkner this boy or young man was often teased by others, and Faulkner himself was very upset by the way other people would tease and bother him. And when even after writing The Sound of the Fury, when he had an infant daughter of his own, he would often take his daughter Jill and go for walks, and they would visit Edwin Chandler. So that's a biographical story I actually love.
That's great. So I'm going to close here. I mentioned before we got started that one of my favorite books is Our Declaration by your Liverite colleague Danielle Allen.
Yeah.
And in that book, she parses the Declaration of Independence kind of line by line, word by word, and parses every possible meaning based on anything from historical context to a change in comma placement made in the editing process.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And you don't go quite that far, but there are a lot of examples in your book of, how do we interpret this particular line, and particularly the old man falls example that you use, where he's asked what they were fighting for, and he says, "Be damned if I ever did know."
Yeah.
And you ask the question: is that he never knew, or is that he thought he knew, but now he realizes he really never did know? But I wonder, is there a line in particular that stands out to you that maybe has been misinterpreted by readers over the years?
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of lines that have been reinterpreted. Here, this question is a test of my memory of how much I can remember particular Faulkner lines. And I have never really been able to, I remember details of plot and character. I've never been able to memorize a poem. So I'm going to cheat. And I'm going to say the shortest chapter in As I Lay Dying, where the character Vardaman, who's about 8 years old, his mother has just died. And simultaneously he's caught a big fish down in the creek. And somehow the two events get confused in his mind, and he says, this is the entirety of this chapter, my mother is a fish. And some early readers took that line to mean as an indication that Vardaman himself was an idiot, that he was crazy, that he was unstable in some way. But no, it's just, he suffered a traumatic event. His mother has just died. Later in the novel, he becomes an entirely reliable, authoritative witness. He doesn't understand everything he's seeing. He's 8, but he's a reliable witness. My mother is a fish, and my students always laugh when they come upon this chapter. This is an entire chapter. But it's what Faulkner does is to suggest that these two things have become associated in his mind in this moment of trauma and gotten themselves confused with each other. But early readers who hadn't yet gotten a handle on what Faulkner was doing, they often did misread that.
Excellent. Dr. Gorra, thank you so much for joining us. This was great. And good luck with the rest of your virtual book tour, okay?
Thank you. I hope my mouse comes back.
All right.
Yeah. Okay. Bye-bye.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.